Right, hello, welcome to my talk. I'm Tristan, this is Hannah. It's actually going to be filming for, it's being live streamed out on Twitter. On the Hot Bags account, which you can see on the screen. I'm basically going to talk about how I make beer, with a focus on sort of my equipment and the modifications I've made to certain things and things that I've done to my house to turn it into a brewery, that kind of stuff. And that, yeah, that's basically what I'm going to be talking about. And there's also going to be a little bit of technical about how beer is made, because some people might not know that. And I've got some ingredients we want to pass around and people can have a look at. The first thing is you need to make beer. How do you do it? What do you make it from? It's made from actually only 4 basic ingredients, and in the early days of beer it was considered it was only made from 3 because they hadn't discovered yeast yet. They just thought you could throw the first 3 ingredients together and then magic made it happen, right? Later on, when Louis Pasteur discovered yeast, it was discovered it was the yeast that was making the beer, well, essentially turning pre-beer into beer. The first ingredient that we use is referred to as liquor. For all intents and purposes, it's water, but the distinction that a brewer will always make to you is you clean the water and make beer with liquor. What that means in a practical sense is we'll typically take the water that comes from the tap and we'll treat it. We'll adjust the levels of carbonates, we'll adjust the levels of sulfates, the alkalinity, the amount of calcium in it, and we'll bring that more in line, typically and historically, to the water of the target region that you're trying to make a beer of. If you wanted to make a lager, you want the softest water possible. The ideal place to go would be Pilsen. The Pilsner beer style was discovered and popularised because the water there is extremely soft and nothing needs to be done to it. In a similar way, if you want to make a stout, we're in the perfect place where we are now. So I live in Kent, I live in the middle of Canterbury, and if I want to make a stout, I don't touch a single bit of the drop of water that comes out. The water that comes out the tap is the brewing liquor that I'll use to make stouts. And that's because it's harder, it's more alkaline, and the dark malts that are used to make darker beers contain acids that bring the pH into line for the rest of the process to occur without affecting the flavour. So that's why we tend to refer to it as liquor. And it's also a historic term, I think. Malted barley is the next ingredient. I'll pass this around in a minute. Malted barley is the next ingredient. This is basically barley, and we use other grains as well. I should have put that on here. Things like wheat you can use, and spelt sometimes, and rye. And what's happened to these is they've been malted, which is a very specific technique where they allow the grain to sprout just a small amount. And what that does is releases sugars and converts gets the energy that's in there ready for sprouting and ready for it to sort of have the energy to become a plant. And then just when that's about to happen, you stop the process and you kiln it, which is exposing it to heat. And the amount of heat that you expose it to gives it different colours, and that's ready for them to go onto the brewer to make the beer with. You can kiln them to different amounts. You can either very lightly kiln it, which results in this very pale malt, which is about 90% of all beers are made of this, even the dark ones, because it contains a lot more sugar. Right the way through to, I think this is a roasted barley, which hasn't even been malted. There's no point malting it because you're going to essentially burn it. It's like burnt toast. And you can see these when I pass them around in a sec. But what happens is these provide the sugar and the colour and the sort of base malt profile that you get in the beer comes from this ingredient. Third, final non-yeast ingredient is hops. This was a brew day that I did quite recently, which had a lot of hops in it. I think this brew day was actually, there was a video of this one on YouTube from Uncle Jonah, who's a YouTuber who does homebrew videos, and he moved locally, and I reached out to him and said, do you want to come and film one of my brew days for me, which he did. So there's a lot, this is a lot of hops, it's hundreds of grams, you wouldn't normally use this many. These are all going in at the end as well. But these things, I've actually got a pelleted form to pass around today. So when this one comes around and it's little pellets, it's basically the same thing as being crushed up and put into these little sort of tubular shaped things. So I will pass these around now. It's top off for all of them. Oh, that smells great actually. I'll pass these. Yeah, the hops. All of these, feel free to try and eat them. It can be done. I don't recommend eating the hops, but there's always someone that does. And they will. You won't taste it. So funny. Yeah. You did want to try a little bit of a malt or something while we're doing after the malt. Yeah. For sure. So those are really going around. Like I said, you've got the and for those interested, this hop that's being passed around is an Australian hop called Vanguard, which I've made. I've used it as a dry hopping beer, dry hop in several beers. So yeast, as I mentioned, being the final ingredient, is basically the thing that does the work. Because a brew does not make beer at all. A brewer makes work. And if a brewer is lucky, yeast comes in and makes beer. So there's billions of little single-cellular organisms that are yeasts, and they do the work of creating beer for us. I use beer yeast in different forms. The one on the right there is a smack pack. See, it's inflated, and that's a liquid yeast, and you actually hit it with your hand, between your hands, and that breaks open a little packet on the inside, which kick-starts the reaction, gives it some food, and it starts to puff up, and that way you know it's good to go. It's a bit of a gimmick, because I smacked them and they don't work before, and you still pitch it, it's fine. Bit of a gimmick, but that's why yeast is a little trick that they have. It's a marketing thing mostly. And the one on the left there is just rehydrated dry yeast. You can buy it like a powder, the same as you would if you were making bread. But you sometimes, if you can be bothered, you add it to some water first. And get it rehydrated. Sometimes I'll just pitch it literally straight on top and it doesn't really. As long as you pitch the right amount of yeast, that's the most important thing. It's also interesting to know different beers require different yeast types. And the same beer with different yeast will taste completely different. It's a key part of the flavour profile as well. So that's the thing. That's the equation, the simplistic equation of how you go about making beer. So now it's more about my kind of process of how we go through that and how it fits into my brew house myself. So that's my shed, or my brew house, which is a shed, with my little hot packers logo on top, which has actually fallen off now. It's sadly not there. But my shed was built for the sole purpose of being a brew house and has never been used for hoses and things. I think there was one hose. Crazy. This is the inside of it. I've got my 3-vessel system there, 2 pumps. I don't think you can see them because they may not be in the shop, but there's 2 pumps underneath. I have 1 pump that's its job is to pump all of the liquor around. The one on the left is to pump all the wort around. The wort is the name that what we call the multi-liquids before they become beer. That's what it looks like inside. And so the actual steps that you would go about to make beer. The first one is called mashing. What this is you take some of that hot liquor, it's basically just hot water in a tea urn. Water's been treated, like I said before. And you dump that in there with the grains that are coming around. Actually, one of the grains that's coming around is whole, and normally you crush that. So I'd actually put that through a mill, crush it up. And you mix it together into a porridge. It's very similar to porridge. Smells like it, looks like it. Has a lot of these sort of elements of it, and it smells great. If you ever come around for a brew day, for anyone, those of you that have been around for brew days with me, or if you've been to a professional brewery where they do this, it smells amazing. What we then do is we get this to exactly the right temperature we want, between 65 and 70 degrees. Again, if you want a sweet beer, you do it higher, about 70, and if you want a drier beer, where more of the sugar is turned into alcohol, then you do it at lower temperature, like 65. Right now I've got a temperature probe problem where it's not calibrated and all my mashes are coming out at 62 and I'm not getting any of my sugar out, which is annoying me, but I'm going to have to redo that. So we check it with a few probes and things like that. And then we seal the mash tun up. This is my old plastic mash tun that couldn't get a shot of the new metal one. But you then leave that for an hour at that temperature, so it's all insulated. And it takes that time for the enzymes that that occur inside the grain because of the sprouting, because kind of it happened and then was stopped. Those enzymes kick into effect and start converting the starches, the long chain carbohydrates, into shorter chain carbohydrates, which are these sugars. And they do that in two ways. You have alpha amylases. It's the same one. It's the same amylase as the thing that's in your spit that turns starch into sugar. And that the alpha one works at the I think it works at the higher temperatures, and that's the one that creates the sort of larger chain sugars. The beta amylases work at lower temperatures and create the shorter chain ones, and that's how you get your fermentability and whether it's going to be dry or sweet beer. And it's quite tricky to get it right because if the temperatures are off, the beer is completely different, and it can and does ruin beers when you don't get it right. The outdrink comes next. It's a fancy term for separating that liquid that's in there. It's got all that sugar that you want to turn into beer. And separating it from the actual solids. So you've got all of those bits of flour and the bits of husk and everything else that's in there. And you need to separate it. Naturally, that will form a bed and you'll be able to drain it. And what you do is just recirculate it around until it runs clear. And then you start transferring it into the third vessel. Because the hot liquor was in the right-hand vessel, then all the mashing happens in the middle one. And this is the transfer process into the final vessel, which is the boiler. This is just a pipe, it's not a brilliant photo, it's just a pipe going into a giant boiler with some kettle elements inside of it. And you run that for a while. Meanwhile, you do a technique called sparging. So this is the top of the grain bed. So inside the vessel, you'll be draining out of the bottom into the boiler. But you'll also continuously dilute that grain with evenly spread, that's why it's a sparge arm, that just evenly spreads it out. And that pump will just be pumping even more clean liquor onto the top, mainly to dilute, to make up the volumes, because the first sugar that comes out, first sugary wort that comes out, if you were to ferment it, you'd get 11% beer. And if you want that, that's what you do. If you're making an imperial stout, that's what you can do. And then you end up with actually lots of extra sugar that you might as well make a small beer as well. And in a lot of cultures and in a lot of breweries, they will do a small beer and a big beer from the same mash. And certainly in, I think it's like, I don't know, like especially as this is going out, I don't want to say something completely wrong, but certainly in older times, that's how they would do it. They would make the big beers that they had for the night and stuff like that, and they'd make the small beer that was like something they drink in the day, something like that. It would be a large and small, a party bar they call it as well, if you want to do it these days. If you want to actually do that yourself, you make a party bar beer. But if you're making a smaller one, you just rinse it through until basically there's not much to come out left, and what's coming out is very watery, and then you basically rinse all the sugar through. And if you've done your maths correctly, you can almost guarantee then that you've got the amount of percentage that you were looking for in terms of your percentage of your final product. So this is how we measure the gravity. Gravity is essentially how much sugar is in a liquid, because it's basically how heavy it is. And we put it a couple of drops of what's coming out.
Rotate the camera, hang on. Just suddenly my face.
There's a couple of drops will go onto this little device here, and you look through it like a telescope, and this is what you see. I actually put the camera up to mine and took this photo. And this is an example of a beer of liquid wort coming out, about 1041, 1042, which will probably generate you a 3.8, 3.9% beer if you just fermented wort of that gravity. But what happens is you keep reading this as it falls, as you're diluting it, and when it hits a certain level, some people say 1010, some people say 1015, you risk extracting tannins, you risk influencing negatively the taste of your beer, so you might decide to call it a day and shut it off and not drain any more out. I tend to just let it go. I've never had any effects, I think. I don't know. Maybe if I made a beer where I didn't do that, it might be nicer, I don't know. I haven't got any samples as well, sorry about that. I ran out. Next up we boil it. So we'll go into all of that stuff will build up into the boiler, and I put the elements on and it will boil. This is where the hops go in, so you can see the hops are there. And hops actually serve several purposes in brewing. The first is the bitterness, the thing you actually taste. The second is their antimicrobial, so they help keep beer from getting infected later on in storage. And as far as we know, that's kind of why things like hops were used, because hops weren't used first. They were introduced to this country from Germany via the Netherlands. What they used to use here was just random stuff they found about. Bolton myrtle, I think, is one of them. Don't know what it is. Things like heather. In Scotland, they certainly use heather. In Scotland, even more recently than that, they saw hops as a very English thing, and they was very much like, no, we don't want hops in our beer. We're fine with heather and all the other stuff that we've got up here. Until hops finally did make it all the way up. But they weren't always used as the main flavouring in beer, but they do work exceptionally well. And they grow really well here as well, that's most important. They're very easy to grow. I actually have some growing in my garden as well. So they boil. The stuff at the beginning of the boil, so you might put hops in and boil it for an hour. The boiling also helps with the sanitation, that cleans kills off all the bacteria, and that extracts most of that bitterness that you taste when you drink a beer. You might also put hops in right at the very end of the boil, and also after, like when it's cooling down, or when it has already cooled down. And that stuff is mostly flavour hops or aroma hops. When you open a can of craft beer, especially when I used to give this talk, lots of people were just still not really drinking craft beer, but you can't move for it now. Everyone's seen a can of Punk IPA or a Brewdog or neck oil or something like that. You can go into Sainsbury's and buy this stuff now. When I first started brewing, one of the reasons I started brewing was because you couldn't get that stuff everywhere. I had to make it. So you kind of know what I mean. You get that big fruity kind of hit. And to get that, it's all putting this stuff in late, putting it right at the very end, and lots of it. And the first I showed you earlier is the big bowls of hops. That's the kind of beer I was making there. It's one of my favourite types. As you mentioned, cooling in the past. I mean, you've got to cool this down now from 100 degrees to 18, which is roughly where you're going to ferment it at. And all the while it's underneath pasteurisation temperatures, which is 70 something, 76. It's liable to infection. So you've got to cool this quickly. You've got to cool it as fast as you can without getting anything, without a fly landing in it or something that's happened before. You know, I'm brewing in the shed, it's out in the garden, you put loads of fly screens up, shut the door, you make sure that there's no dust. Cat furs on your clothing, we've got cats, cat furs everywhere. This is one way to cool. I actually don't cool this way anymore. Then you put a coil inside, pass cold water through the coil, you get nice hot cleaning water comes out the other side, you can use for cleaning later on. And that'll cool it in 20 minutes, something like that. I now actually pass the hot work through one side of a counterflow heat exchanger, the same sort of one you'd find inside a combi boiler, and then cold water through the other side, and then you match the flow rate so it's coming out at the right temperature, and just go straight into the fermenter rather than having to wait for it in here and then transfer it. There's kind of pros and cons to each approach, but if anyone's thinking of getting into brewing, I recommend this approach because things get stuck in the filters, and I had a brew day the other day that was an absolute disaster. I ended up having, fortunately, loads of people around to help me. I had to lift up vessels and pouring it into different things. It was horrible. So always go with this solution. It's cheaper and it's easier. So yeah, this is how I would do the transfer. So this was where the transfer is in 2 steps. All this really is opening the tap and letting it go. Oxygenation is very important though. So you want to splash it as much as you can, have some distance, get the bubbles, get the oxygen in there, because otherwise the yeast has nothing to consume. It's consuming the sugar, turning it to alcohol, but it needs oxygen as well. For its first stage, the lag phase, it needs lots and lots of oxygen. So you can splash it as well with the spoon, that kind of stuff, but I just let it drop into the fermenter. It's usually enough. I also got like a pump that's like an aquarium pump that you can pump air into it with a little bubble stone. But cleaning all that stuff up and knowing that it's definitely clean for the next brew, because it's all cold side and you do not want to get anything in there when it's cold side. It's all fine afterwards. You can drink it from the thing and put it back in. It doesn't really matter what you drop in there because it's boiling. But once you get to here, even one cat fur could ruin that whole brew. Then we measure the gravity. So this is a little bit like the gravity reading that we used, the little refractometer for.
I'm going to try, yeah.
And this is more of a this is a more accurate way of measuring it, and it's essentially it's called a hydrometer, and you float it. and it will flow at a different level depending on how heavy that liquid is. So this one's measuring like 1046, so about 4.5%, 9%, something like that. 4% is about where I make most of my beers because I can drink a fair number of them in the evenings and then still go to work next day, which is always good. Whereas actually the one I'm making at the moment is like 6 points something. You can't do it as much. It's also easier to balance the flavours when you're actually designing the recipe. Fermentation is the final step, which is, well, it's not really, it's the final production step. And as I said, it's the yeast's job. Yeasts will throw these things called krausens, which are these bubblegum heads on top, and you always know it's a nice healthy fermentation when you see that. On the left there, I think that's my first beer I ever made. And it's a plastic fermentation bucket. And then this is my more recent stainless steel one, which I don't normally open. If I can sense it's going to be working, you don't really want to mess with opening it and risking things flying in there. So let me try not to. I control my fermentation and the temperature because you want to make sure that you keep exactly onto one temperature because any up and down can stress the yeast out and throw really horrible flavours. Really horrible flavours like acetones and horrible things like that. You sometimes go to homebrew club, someone gives you a beer that just tastes like acetone. And I think we had one recently and the guy said it was 4.5%. It tastes like sherry. Something had gone wrong with that fermentation for sure. Keeping the temperature steady with this controller helps. I actually built this myself. You can buy these units and then I put it into a box with heating and cooling. And then whack it in the fridge and you have the heater at the bottom, fridge is the cooler, and it just turns it on when it's, heats when it's too cold, chills when it's too warm. Bottling is the worst part. So yeah, you can just imagine it's mechanical and it's horrible. But we occasionally bottle. I don't do so much bottling anymore. Here's some of my beers. Geek conference, so all the names are up there. You can guess some of the jokes. No jokes, some Ruby, Java, C++. C++ have 3 C hops in it. Black IPA with the hex value for black. Things like that. There's some more silly names, not so much silly names. A-Day was good, and that's one you know.
Yeah.
There's another row of these. This was actually Tim's New Year party. You can't quite read the names on there, but I think we did one of every beer we've made that year. That's a very busy year. I also got myself a kegger in it because I can't be bothered with a spot like that. So I bought a cheap fridge, covered it in some wood coloured stuff, being plastic, and I now use kegs, and it's so much nicer. It's transferring one lot of beer into it, and then it's just leaving it, and you want a beer, you just open it up. It's wonderful. And I can get two kegs from it. That's basically it. A few resources up here for those who want to. I know there's a couple of people here who wanting to get started with brewing. Hop Hackers, which is my brewery that we call it. We have a Facebook and Twitter where you can just see what we do on brew days. There's also, if you are local, there's an Amateur Brewers Club and that Twitter address. They also have a Facebook if you search for it, and that's held locally, first Wednesday of every month in the Unicorn Pub. There's a great homebrew shop in Faversham, hidden down the back streets, but if you Google it, on St Mary's Road if you do know the area, which is great and good to support local businesses. Brew UK is the online shop I use for loads of other ones out in Malta, stuff like that. And then finally, Beersmith is the software that I use for creating recipes, which I was going to show you, but I haven't, so I'll leave that there. And then you can't quite see it because it faded, but it says #include_beer.h on the glass. I got that from Think Geek many years ago, and it's rubbed off. That's it. Any very quick questions?
Do you sell it or do you have to drink it all yourself?
I have to drink it all myself and give it away. Licensing and stuff like that means I'm not allowed to sell it or even take trades for it unless you register with HMRC. If you do that, you have to register as a business. You can't then homebrew on the same kit, because the kit has to be registered, and it would mean I have to buy my own beers off myself for at least the tax. And as soon as the alcohol is generated, you're liable for paying the tax. And the tax is a lot. So at least I think, as last time I checked, at least 70% of what you pay at a pub is tax.
It's going up as well.
Yeah, it's always going up. I mean, I don't really do this to save money, but lots of people get started in this because it's about 30p to 50p a pint. Even it's a pound a pint, including thousands of pounds for equipment. And you don't have to do it on thousands of pounds of equipment, you can do it on a plastic bag.